Okay, this is my grandma. Okay, how did the Vietnam War affect your family?
Oh, shoot.
We can end this. This is my grandma. Okay. How did the Vietnam War affect you and your family?
Well, the Vietnam War affected my family in that first, shortly after we were married, my husband and I, we were just married, and he received his notice to report for selective service. And really scared us at that time. You were drafted, and so he went and reported, but he was turned down, but only if things got worse, which later it did, and he would have had to go. But then about 3 years or so after that, my brother, who was just graduating from Purcell High School, joined. And he went in under the buddy system, which a lot of his friends were all graduating from Purcell High School and thought it was really their duty, and went. And but my brother and his buddy, my brother got sent to Vietnam, and his buddy got sent to Alaska. So the buddy system didn't work. And then, as my brother said in many later years after that, as he was going through some issues with it, he kept saying all the time that there were so many boys who should never have gone to Vietnam, no matter why or what their reasons for. And a lot of them went, as my brother did, because he thought he would be better having gone into the military and having gone to Vietnam. And my brother, when he was there, evidently he was in construction, and he had loved motor pool. He had loved fixing cars and everything else. In fact, that's the business that he has today and did very well in. He was in like the front lines, and they laid the roads and maintained the equipment and all for building the roads in Vietnam. And apparently he was asked to do a lot of things that really he questioned, and he had to do it. And he came home from Vietnam after going in only as 18 and being there, I don't know, 3 years. He came home, and when he arrived, and it was during the height then of the protests against Vietnam, and when he landed in California, they got off the planes and they were met with protesters, and they were spit on, and it was just really hard. He came then from there to Cincinnati, and we greeted him with posters and banners, and he was just crushed. Well, that feeling followed him really through his life, and I guess with the Vietnam War then, as it goes on, he's had issues in dealing, especially, when anyone passes or he has to go, he can't handle any of that, especially with children. So we think that he had some issues there that he could never express. But as he turned 65, which we followed then, a lot of the Vietnam issues weren't addressed as they are, because now I have a niece who works with the soldiers and all coming back from Afghanistan and Iraq and everything, but some of the issues that they're helping them with now weren't addressed at the Vietnam time. But now, fortunately, it's only been in the last 2 years, the Vietnam War issue has entered into the VA system, and they are addressing them. And fortunately, we found the right help, because as they were realizing, a lot of the Vietnam veterans, as they turned 65 and were pondering their life and their background and things they dealt with and things, they found that they weren't addressing some of their main issues very well, and they have gotten some good counseling and all now. And fortunately, my brother, we were fortunate to find the right the right help for him, and he's doing well now. But the Vietnam War really impacted families lifelong in many ways.
That's Uncle Gary, right?
Yes, yes. My little brother, and he's doing great now, and we're really so proud of him. But it's taken a lot of work because, as he said, he came home, and when he was needing help, he kept saying, "What can they tell me, and what can they help me with, and what can anyone say to help me?" But he kept saying that he just needed to tell someone what he had to do. And that's a very hard thing to put on young men, I think, in any kind of a war situation. A lot of it with Iraq and some of the different wars that we're going through now, but especially during the Vietnam War, when it was kind of covered up and shoved under the table and hidden, it's had repercussions in a lot of family. We're very lucky in that he did very well in life. He was very successful. He has a group coming through his high school. He's closer to his buddies than hardly anybody I've ever seen. And but a lot of them did not come back very well. And that was another hard thing. He kept telling us during the time we were taking him for help that there were just so many that should never have gone and should never have been asked to do what they were asked to do.
You just go ahead.
I always was told by my family that that we were only here. Like my grandparents were born here, but everyone above them came over from Germany. But I always was told by both sides of the family, my father's and my mother's families, that we were from Alsace-Lorraine, which was on the German-French border. So that they would say it's German one day, French the next. So but we were primarily German. Well, just recently, in our daughter researching some of the history and everything in Cincinnati and watching different things on TV as they've been presenting some of the German heritage and things, it was brought out that most of the Germans who came to Cincinnati would say that because of the discrimination against Germans after the war and stuff. They didn't want to say that they were German, so they would say they were from. But my family truly was. When we did the research and they traced them all back and we did the ancestry, they really were from the Alsace-Lorraine area, and they were German and French, but they came over also and lived through a lot of that. As it was wonderful to arrive in Cincinnati and over the Rhine in the German community, there was still some discrimination if you were German. So it was an interesting concept. Plus, we had one part of our family we could never find, and they came in through, the majority came in through the normal, but again, most of them just at the time of my great-grandparents' time. But they also were coming in, you hear all of the entry in through Ellis Island and everything, but they came through New Orleans, and I thought that was interesting. And the first wave of my father's family came over, and just the parents came, and it was a tough time in Germany at the time. They were having rough times, and they came here as businessmen, and they came to assess the situation, and they established business here in Cincinnati, but they had left their children back in Germany. And so they actually went back to Germany and then brought the children over after they were established here in Cincinnati. I thought that was pretty interesting.
That's okay.
That was it?
No, that's good. Okay.
Was that first?
Okay.
Well, first, PaPa and I grew up just about a mile from each other. I lived on the top of the hill, and PaPa lived on the bottom of the hill. And I heard of PaPa before I knew him, in that I went to parochial school. He went to public school, but a lot of the kids in my class would talk about this fellow Ross, which I thought was an unusual name. So I kind of heard of him before I met him, and frankly, I was kind of worried. I thought, gee, that sounds like a wild bunch. I don't know if I ever hook up with those people. But anyway, I lived on the top of it. Papa lived at the bottom, but we had one of the first TVs in the neighborhood, and my mother was quite an athlete. She was quite accomplished, and she was doing different athletics things than we had. And my daddy was an only child, and mom and dad, I have three sisters and a brother, and so when mom would be out and daddy would be in charge of us kids, my grandparents, my daddy's parents, used to come up to the house. And I can remember it was just so much fun because it was like as Sullivan and shows like that were on TV, and that's what you watched in the evening. Otherwise, I don't remember watching it just as our kids or something. But my mother would be out, and my daddy would be taking care of us, and he'd have grandma and grandpa there. And my grandma and grandpa became avid wrestling fans. And oh my gosh, it was such phony, fake wrestling. It was comedic, but they'd get
entertainment.
It was pure entertainment, and they would be so charged up and everything. And Daddy'd make popcorn, and we kids would be laying under the chairs, and my grandma and grandpa would be cheering and yelling thing, and it was just kind of a really entertaining environment with the first TV, the biggest thing I can remember. And then I used to get up real early on Saturday mornings to watch cartoons by myself. I was the oldest before my little sisters and my brother would get up, and I used to think it was really neat to get up and watch cartoons and eat my bowl of cereal. But those were the only things I really remember about the TV. When I was just listening to we had recorded my parents at one point, and my father was discussing how he had a cab company during the time of all the rationing during the war, and trying to run a large cab company. World War II. He had everything was rationed, and the hardest things were gas and tires, and he had a hard time getting enough gas and all to run the cab company. And he was, at that time, they had contracts with the schools to run transportation. And like I mentioned before, it was even a courier service. So he got to the point where he was going to have to cut half of his business. He didn't have enough gas, and he couldn't get rationing, but he kind of played a political card with some of the connections he had and the other businesses he had, and he went over the heads of the rationing bureau and went into the political realm up in Columbus and Cleveland and got extra gas and rationing cards, and came back, and when he then went to redeem them here locally, they were really affronted by how did he get these, and it was like, well, who do you know and stuff, and he had them and they had to honor them. But it was interesting to hear how trying to run a business and stuff back during that time for the most essential things like gas and tires. And then he went in the one time and he said the fellow in charge of rationing the tires didn't have a car and had never driven, and my dad went in with the tires and said he just needed retreads, and the guy said no, he wouldn't give him the permission for retreads. And he says, well, I'm going to be back in 2 months then and need new tires. And they said, well, that's okay. So anyway, it was just interesting hearing him having to deal with the rationing issue, where my mother's rationing was more from the food side.
Okay, we are going to talk about Jimmy Carter and your family's opinion on him. Papa, you want to start?
My family is basically Democrats. Grandma's family is basically Republicans.
Well, except no, my father's family was Republican, but my mother's family was very Democrat. That was always an issue. Yes, business for that was back in the old days when it was like conservative liberal and business versus whatever. So Daddy being business and his family was Republican. My mother's was Democrat.
Okay. So anyway, I forget what I was going to say.
Jimmy Carter.
Jimmy Carter was a peanut farmer in Georgia, and we really liked him. My dad, mom, everybody in our immediate family.
Well, they were all from Georgia.
Some of them were from Kentucky.
Well, your mother's family was from Kentucky, but your father's family was one of his great uncles was the first governor of Georgia. They came in on the coast and went directly down to Georgia.
Okay.
And they were all Georgia.
Well, anyhow, my dad was a union pipe fitter, and of course, unions were very pro-democratic, and they loved Jimmy Carter, and we got that peanut there to
Here, his family, his mother and father were so excited. This is a sterling silver peanut dish, and we have that from his family. But they were Georgia. But then also we found out then when we did the family history that his family, they're actually related.
Related to Jimmy Carter?
Jimmy Carter, the Terrells, but the Terrells were very Georgia, and then way pre-Civil War, there was a whole Terrell contingent, a whole Terrell group that fought on a mountain in Georgia. It just goes, his family in Georgia and pre-Civil War from the very beginning is.
And Pappy Johnson,
yes.
He was, I guess, distant uncle. He was a colonel in the Confederate Army, if I remember right.
Does that mean I'm related to Jimmy Carter?
Yes, you're related to Jimmy Carter. Yeah, the Terrells are related to. Now I got one of the first times I met your father's family. I was at their house and we got into a little bit. It was during the Kennedy. It was during Kennedy and Nixon, and I was really surprised because I was Catholic and they weren't, but they were really for Kennedy. And my family, I always kind of followed my daddy's family, who was Republican, so I was very much for Nixon. And I always remember Papa Terrell, his father, was sitting in the rocking chair, and we got to talking, and I had just barely met them, and I was just 17 years old. And he was shaking his fingers so hard at me, he fell out of the rocking chair. So anyway, he didn't like, the Terrells were very, very Democrat and very much Jimmy Carter. And I was not real happy with him at the time, but I am a tremendous admirer of Jimmy Carter now and the efforts and the work that he does. I think he is a tremendous person.
What about Reagan?
Wait a minute. I want to say something more about Carter. I agree with Grandma. I think he turned and did tremendous work in Habitat for Humanity and those kind of missionary types of things that he did.
Peacekeeping, his peace.
But I do have one beef with him.
You have beef with him?
Yes.
Yeah. He boycotted the 1980 Olympics.
Which
kept the Olympics from
America
participating.
Yes.
And Russia.
Was that Uncle Jim?
Well, it was just ahead of Uncle Jim. In fact, that was an amazing story for Uncle Jimmy making the '84 Olympics, because
let me clear.
Yeah.
He's my uncle, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Our son Jim made the '84 Olympic team, and he was it was down to, it was a very, very close finals in the competition and the qualifying. And it was down to one race, and it was a two-man canoe race that was going to decide who went to LA for the '84 Olympics. And his partner was a man who had made the 1980 Olympics when they didn't get to go. And boy, he was so, so disappointed and really wanted to make the team, but he wasn't going to make this team. He didn't have enough points, but he was having to compete as a partner to our son who needed this race. And it was such an exciting race. It was really close, and we didn't know how much he would be able to give since he had gone through the disappointment of qualifying and making the team, the Olympics before, when he didn't get to go. But he gave it his all, and they just collapsed at the finish, and he was so happy he said, "We got you on the team, Jim, you get to go." And he was so exciting, and it was excited for Jim, and it was exciting for that team with the disappointment of the Olympics the time before.
When did he go to Seoul?
He went to LA in '84, Seoul in '88, Barcelona in '92, and Atlanta in '96.
What do you think of Seoul?
Oh, I loved Seoul. Papa didn't go to Seoul.
Oh.
I went to Seoul with your mother, your mommy, and I went to Seoul, and it was an incredible experience. It was hard for Jim, and that he had said after the '84 Olympics that he didn't get to race. He was the youngest that made the team, and he didn't get to compete. And he said he'd never be in that position again. He was gonna just be first all the way, and he had been the whole 4 years before the Seoul Olympics. But a month or 2 months before Seoul, he got mononucleosis. He'd been in an automobile accident and got mononucleosis while he was at the hospital. And anyway, he wasn't in his best, but he made the team. In fact, the whole team again worked to get him on the team because they knew he really deserved to go. So we went to Seoul, but he didn't get to compete strongly. But the experience was incredible. The biggest thing I felt in Seoul, it was an Olympics where all of the family stayed together in the Olympic Village, and I'd never been in such an experience where you'd be in a group and everybody looked the same, but we're speaking all different languages and eating all different things, and it was just an incredible experience. Plus, it was such a Seoul for me was a very kind of a spiritual area, in that there was such a respect of person and place for it being so crowded. They seemed to have such a respect of person and place. It was a tremendous experience for me. I really enjoyed Seoul.
Were there a lot of tensions at the Olympics in LA when Russia didn't go?
PaPa was part of that. In fact, he was. I was a volunteer in hospitality, but PaPa was in boat control. He had to measure all the canoes, and yes, there was. He had to measure. It's when there were still the two Germanys, and East German. They used to bring their canoes and boats and everything all undercover and just unveil them at the last minute. Everything was always very competitive and very secretive. And yes, PaPa was the one who had to determine which boats could race and which couldn't. And yes, there was a lot of that.
There's a lot of intimidation when you look up at some of those great big guys.
Oh.
And
you better hope your measurements go in their favor.
Well, and it was a there was a lot of drug enhancement at the time that was questionable. Plus, as our son always pointed out, most of the athletes from some of those countries, their lives and livelihood was dependent upon their performance. It wasn't just the United States athletes, especially in the sport of canoeing. Now, some of the other sports weren't the same, but in the sport of canoeing, it was very much you had to pay your own way and earn your own way, and it was, camping and everything else to make a life to get there. But it was, yes, it was very.
But once they made the team, they were well taken care of.
Yeah. Romanians and
Hungary and some of those guys.
Now, Jimmy was training with the Russian team in Florida, because they were better provided for in their training. Like our team would go to Florida, and they'd be camping. In fact, People magazine did a feature on how poor the canoe team was in Florida, living in vans and camping, where Canada, Russia, everybody else bought whole communities in Florida for their athletes to live in and train here, to go then to competitions, where the U.S. was down there camping out and stuff like that. But Jimmy was training with the Russians in Florida when Russia fell, and he was best friends with these guys, and all of a sudden they had no country. And then one of your mother's very best friends that she used to write to and all back in the days before that Olympics was on the East German team. Your mother used to communicate with the East Germans and how excited they were when they got there. But Jimmy always said that through all those years when he was on the line in competition, you didn't really see the countries. That's what he used to say, the media build up the hype of the countries and stuff. He said when he was on the starting line and looking across the field, he didn't see Russia, Germany, whatever. He saw Franz and John and Yurka and some of his best friends. In fact, his very best friend right now in the canoe sport is the guy from Canada who won out in California, Larry Kane.
Oh, I raced with him.
Yes, you did. You raced with Larry Kane. He's one of his best friends.